start this. Okay. Okay. Can everyone see the screen? Yay. Yes. Okay. So I wear a couple hats. Part of the way I got in front of you all is I have a company called DAO Labs. So I'll talk a little bit about the company at the end, and I'm happy to spend more time on that if you want. But I thought you guys are all students of Chinese medicine. I'm a practitioner of Chinese medicine. I've been practicing for over 20 years. I'm also an anthropologist, and I do a lot of research on Chinese medicine. And I've had some amazing experiences because of that. I've originally studied Chinese medicine at the Beijing University of Chinese Medicine in the late 1990s. And as a result, I'm a fluent Chinese speaker, and that's opened up a lot of doors for research. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about today, related to new products that we've have coming out, but is I'm calling it sort of the principles and some therapies for treating Gaomao. Gaomao is like a lot of things in Chinese medicine, it is a kind of a general term. It is both the name of, it's a term you use all the time when you're speaking. If somebody is sick, people will say, "Oh, you got mao, you're sick. You've got a cold." Basically, you've got a cold. But it is also kind of really a concept in Chinese medicine. It's sort of a disease concept. And I want to sort of argue today that it's really the concept we need to be thinking about, basically the worst winter in a century, thinking about colds, flu, but really also COVID-19. All those things present pretty much the same way. You have the same sort of basic set of symptoms. And so what I want to do is give you a little bit of some interesting history here on how to think about this term Gaomao and how to get to a treatment of it. So I've got a little agenda for you. And one thing I want to argue is that there's a lot of confusion about this, and even though we don't think of this 2020 has changed everything, but prior to that, I think most, even in my own training, I think most doctors of Chinese medicine didn't think too much about a cold. You get a cold, you ride it out. The flu is a little bit more concerning, but it's mostly concerning for kids or older folks. COVID-19 is sort of changing all of that. But practitioners aren't necessarily so great at treating it, and there's some reasons for that. And I'm going to get into some of the historical debates around that, and I think that's the part that will be perhaps the most surprising to you. And then I'll try to come back to some treatment principles, tell you a little bit about what we're doing at DAO Labs. You know about that, and I think it's a very interesting approach, obviously, because I'm involved in it. And then we'll wrap up, and I'm happy to take any questions. So the first thing I really want to emphasize for treating Gaomao, and we can just translate this as kind of cold and flu. If you throw COVID in there, you might just maybe cold season ailments is sort of my translation at the moment. But the key principle really here is wind, and I would say secondarily cold, but wind above all. And you'll see why I'm going to emphasize that in a second. So, as I said, many of us are not so skilled at treating colds. You'll see when you get into your practice, there's challenges. One, it's extremely important this winter to learn to be good at it. It's really a basic skill set, but we don't often have these skills as practitioners, particularly here in the U.S. One reason is in Chinese medicine, we're often treating more chronic disorders. Patients are usually coming in with a biomedical diagnosis. You're working with them over weeks and months. This, however, is, there's a really interesting historical take here. And if you're interested, I'd recommend some of my writings about this. Chinese medicine didn't used to be about treating chronic disorders. In fact, and this was a surprise even to me, really in the early 20th century, most doctors of Chinese medicine focus on treating very acute conditions. But that's not well known, and that's not what I was taught when I was a student there in the 1990s. Uh, practicing in the U.S., what you'll find is often your patients, they say, I've caught a bug, I've come down with something. They typically don't come to see you. They cancel their patients. They cancel their appointments. I always will tell my patients when they come back, hey, I can treat you for that too if you want. But often they don't really think about it. Um, and then kind of getting into the treatment principles here, there when you get into your herbal medicine courses, you're going to see there's a lot of formulas. Uh, they all seem to kind of treat something similar like Gamao. So there's almost too many choices. And with acupuncture and other techniques, there's lots of things you can do. It's kind of hard to know what works best. And since you don't have people coming in that often to see you, then you don't necessarily get the experience, and one thing leads to another. And it's taken me personally quite a bit of time to to develop some of that experience. And so that's what I want to share with you today. It also happens to kind of very interestingly tie in with my research. So I'm going to take you through some of the research. And I would say there's another big reason why we're often not good at treating Gamao, or we'll just call them cold season ailments, is that and I think you'll encounter this in your textbooks. Now, of course, as I mentioned, my training was from mainland China, so I'm familiar with the system there, and a little bit less familiar with how it's taught here in the U.S. Although, obviously, the textbooks and things like that from mainland China are extremely influential. But what you would learn in mainland China is you'd learn a kind of a mixture of formulas. But if you were to really look deep and kind of break down the formulas, where do they come from? You would find, a good number of them come from what we could call the cold damage approach, the Shanghai Pai. There's a whole school of cold damage, and I'll run through that history a little bit. But there's also the warm illness approach. That has a very different history, and they're very different formulas with very different principles. So both seem to treat the same basic problems, but they've got really radical different theories, and the formulas are quite different. We'll try to get into a little bit today, and if you really want to read about this particular debate, I've got an article which is open source, so you can. It's an academic article published in the journal called Asian Medicine, which is a scholarly journal with a lot of excellent scholarship, a lot of it historical. It's a little bit less clinically focused, which is where you're all are at. My writing, because I'm also a practitioner too, I always try to have that kind of clinical focus in my writing. So this is a fun one. This is, I think, one of my favorite articles that I've written, and it's pretty technical. So unless you're a practitioner, you might not want to dive into it. But if you are, I would really encourage you to read it. I'll give you a little taste of it here. So you may or may not be aware, but there is a historical tension between these two camps, if you will, but we don't really encounter it in our studies today. That's also very complicated. Why? But today they're all kind of fall under this methodology of Bianzheng and I assume that's sort of I don't know if you know that Chinese term, but the rest of it translates as pattern determination and treatment discrimination, or we can translate it a couple of different ways: pattern recognition, treatment determination. I think I haven't decided which way I like to translate it, but it is just one word in Chinese. Bianzheng. Zheng is this idea of pattern, and zhi means treatment. So figure out what that pattern is and treat it. Now, you may or may not be aware of this, but there's a good bit of scholarship on this, and I've written about this, and I've got a book manuscript that'll come out maybe by the end of 2021. Hopefully, it's under contract at the moment, but really looks at the history of Bianzheng. And in the early 20th century, there really wasn't that term. And there's a few other folks who have written about this. Volker Schad, you might be aware of his research, has written about this, but not that history quite as in quite as much detail. But there wasn't this term, so there wasn't sort of a way to kind of put everything under one umbrella and sort of which is what scholars have done in the late 20th century, as Chinese medicine was sort of being institutionalized from like the 1950s on, and this is under the communist period. In the communist period, everyone was trying to sort of work things out and make sure everyone could be like happy. There could be consensus. And basically, Benjamin Linger was a very convenient term for doing that, because you could say cold damage is one way of doing it, the warm illness is just another way of doing it. However, because there wasn't this concept of pattern determination and treatment discrimination in the early 20th century, there was instead intense debates between these two camps. These are debates that I was unfamiliar with until I started really reading this literature from the early 20th century. And it was tremendously fun to read about, because the debates everyone was so mean to each other. You'll see I have a few quotes for you. It was just like the fights were just vicious. And nobody would, and it was very shocking for me to see that kind of language, because everyone is quite respectful to each other. You may be a little bit more of a warm illness practitioner in China today, or you may fall more into that cold damage camp, but you would never just trash the other one for being a bad doctor. You'll see that's what they did though in the 20th century, early 20th century. So just for like a super quick history lesson, if you haven't encountered like this sort of cold damage current as a nice way to talk about it at a school, it originates from the writings of Zhang Zhongjing, who is kind of lived in the 2nd century AD or CE. The book was originally called Treatise on Cold Damage and Miscellaneous Disorders, the Shanghan Zaping Lun. Now, it has a very complicated history. It kind of got lost, and it got reorganized in some moments, and it ends up being, and parts get found and other parts aren't found for much later, but it ends up being broken up into 2 books: the Treatise on Cold Damage, Shanghan Lun, which is much more focused on cold is the operative term here, but these are all sort of pathogens coming from, not all, but very much focused on sort of things coming from without. The Zabing is much more, you might say something like the miscellaneous disorders is a little bit more like an internal medicine book. That becomes the synopsis of the Golden Coffer. That part of the book, though, is not found until almost, I think, 1000 or 1100 AD. So very interesting history of how it gets kind of rediscovered and reclaimed and transmitted. In the Treatise on Cold Damage, that part that doesn't get lost too much but gets reorganized, there's a real focus on 3 yang and 3 yin, or sometimes you hear the 6 jing, jing being the same word that we use today for channels and meridians, although is that really appropriate to call them channels or meridians then? That's another question. But in the text itself, it really talks more about the terms are 3 yang, 3 yin. That's closer to the true way it's written about. But that's sort of your diagnostic model, and you might think of that as almost like levels of different levels, different sections of the body. There's been many ways to interpret what those things mean. But so anyways, for our purposes, this is a book that's almost 2,000 years old, and goes back to, this is the late Han Dynasty period, one of the early first great dynasties in China. Now the warm illness current is much more current. So at least when I was a student busy studying, none of that made a whole lot of sense to me. Didn't really matter that much. And in history of Chinese medicine as it's presented in China, and probably, I'm guessing, as you learn it, the idea, the way the history is usually told is it's sort of just a general kind of development, accretion, evolution. Things just kind of, people keep refining it and getting a little bit better. And so warm illness school is sort of just thought of as one more development, one more innovation that comes along, this time in the late imperial period. The key figures here, and I'm mentioning them here because they're going to come up in some of these fun quotes I'll show you in a second, are Ye Tianshi. Ye Tianshi is the guy in the black and white there. He lived, late 17th, early 18th century. Later, when you study warm illness formulas, you're going to learn about this. I think in English it's called 4-sector diagnosis. That's the Wei Qi Yin Xue. Xue means blood. So And that's definitely a way of thinking about different levels of the depth of a kind of illness. Now, he is often considered the founder of the warm illness school, but he himself never claimed to found anything. In fact, I think he probably, and if you're familiar with the work of Volker Scheid, I think he's been writing about this recently. He probably thought of himself as a very good scholar of the treatise on cold damage. So he was really thought of himself as part of that tradition. But he was a very eclectic scholar, a very, very interesting practitioner. And his works became very popular. And this idea of the four-sector diagnosis sort of originates with him. It's really only with another scholar that follows him, and you can see it's kind of really a generation later. It's Wu Jutong. Wu Jutong is kind of practicing in you can see the late 18th to the early 19th century. He writes a book called, in English, I think it's called Systematic Differentiation of Warm Illnesses. And he kind of pulls it together. He's trying to write a book that's really systemizing this approach that's sort of emerging out of Yi Tianshi and some other scholars. He organizes it around a triple burner diagnosis, so not the Wei Qi Yin Xue, but the triple burner. But really, you could say his work is the beginning of the warm illness current. And you can see it's really I'm going to show you the next slide. It's really kind of a recent invention in terms of, here, let me back up. It's a recent invention in terms of Chinese medicine. Now, what are some of the differences? Let me I'll quickly show you some formulas. These may not make a lot of sense to you if you haven't gotten too far in your training, but on the left-hand side are formulas from the Shanghan Lun, and that's things like cinnamon twig decoction, ephedra decoction, minor blue-green dragon decoction. All of these would be found in really the first section of the treatise on cold damage disorder. I mentioned that, just if you're not familiar with the herbs here, just put cinnamon twig and ephedra in your head for a second. Ma Huang, we'll come back to that. On the right are some formulas, mulberry twig and chrysanthemum drink. Probably the most popular one is Yin Chao San. You may already be familiar with that. Honeysuckle and forsythia powder. What I'm going to tell you will maybe influence how you think about some of these formulas. The Qing Yin Tang, so remember the Yin is the third sector. This is one to clear that sector. So you have really different formulas, and if we were to break them down and then look at the herb, you could see it's in the Shanghai side, it tends to be more warming herbs. Although there are ways to use there are very cooling formulas too in that tradition. And on the right-hand side, there tend to be cooling herbs, and that's thought to be more suitable for treating this problem of warmth. So why? So you might ask, or this is a question I never asked, but until later in my research. But you might ask, why did the warm illness school come along? Is it the typical answer in your history books is that it's just it's just another innovation. It turns out to be a relatively recent one, right? It's only becoming popular really in the 19th century. And it also turns out to be one that's quite regional. And it becomes very popular really in what we might call southern China. And by that, we mean kind of including sort of the Yangtze River Delta. This is sort of Shanghai. Shanghai doesn't really exist at that moment, but Nanjing, Suzhou, Wuxi, all these very important cities in what would have been the most affluent part of China at that time in Chinese history. Chinese history, early in the Han Dynasty, it's centered more in the north. Gradually, it gets the center of sort of Chinese culture and civilization, if you will, gets pushed towards the south. So it turns out one interesting reason why the warm illness school became so popular in the South was that, and this is really based on some research from Marta Hansen. She's got a book, Speaking of Epidemics in Chinese Medicine. This is a wonderful book, and you can read some of her writing too. But Southerners really thought of themselves as having delicate bodies. They thought of themselves as being very different than Northerners in China. So there was a real sort of North-South distinction in China. Now that doesn't exist so much today, but maybe it's probably still around a little bit. And so because there's this sort of regional distinction and real, now one reason, and you're like, well, why are Northerners more robust? Well, there's probably some historical reasons too. The North is also sort of the place where all the sort of invaders are coming. These are sort of the Mongols, the Jurchen, the Manchu, many of these powerful, rather small nomadic tribes that conquered or controlled large parts of China in its later imperial history, all come from the North. So there are some kind of ethnic distinctions there potentially at play in the background a little bit too. So one important element of the warm illness school is that these formulas were considered to be more gentle than cold damage formulas. And there is something about the Shanghai formula. They kind of pack a wallop if you get used to using them. And a famous quote that you would see in the early 20th century, in particular from folks who were in that warm illness camp, is that they would talk about things like ephedra, this is ma huang, and cinnamon twigs, which is guizhi. They would say these were feared as if they were snakes and scorpions. That was a very common expression. There were snakes and scorpions. These are just like things you want to stay away from. We don't want to like even touch ephedra or cinnamon twigs. Now this is the Shanghai Lun, opens with these formulas. Ma Huang Tang is the ephedra decoction, maybe one of the first decoctions in the book. So they're really quite important, quite powerful. Ephedra, you may know, you can no longer, Ma Huang is no longer important. It is a quite powerful. It is a very powerful herb. It is. And you can no longer just import it into the U.S. So it's an issue. So they're not talking about nothing here. Cinnamon twigs, I don't think of personally as being quite as strong, but there are other things in the Shanghai Lun that are quite powerful. So there's this important part of history. This part of history is important. Why is the warm illness school tend to be located more in the South? Has to do with these like regional differences in China. The debate between the two camps really kind of comes to a head, particularly in the early 20th century and maybe the late 19th century as well, really the late 19th century. And part of this has to do with sort of new trends in Confucian scholarship. And there's a long history to this as to why, but there's a real reverence for Han Dynasty texts. Remember the Shanghai Lun, the treatise on cold damage disorders, is from the Han Dynasty. And any text, now this is medical or not, but any text written from like the Song Dynasty on, the Song is this major point in transition point in Chinese history, was just considered speculative and erroneous. And you may have heard of Neo-Confucianism. That's a trend within Confucian thought that really begins with the Song. So Neo-Confucianism is thought as a corruption of Confucianism. Any medical text that comes out of that period is also thought of as a corruption of medical writing. So like the Shanghai Lun is just being corrupted or misunderstood by all these sort of late imperial writers. Now the folks who had this who were part of this camp are going to end up being the cold damage folks. They are probably less in number compared to the warm illness folks, especially in the Yangtze River area. But they are also very important and very influential. And many of the doctors from this early 20th century period were considered leading innovators. They're revered scholars. If you ask people, if you're in China and talking to doctors of Chinese medicine, you start asking them about the famous doctors from the early 20th century in China, they'd all start talking about the folks who are sort of in this camp, who revere the Han Dynasty text and therefore sort of despise like warm illness. So you can see there's a real tension building here because of some complicated intellectual trends, but the two camps are sort of coming to a head in the early 20th century. So I think the next slide will give you a taste of like how, particularly from this side of it, how bitter the writings of these folks in the cold damage school are. So let me show you a few. These might be a little bit too much to read, but I'm going to read the one on the far left for you, and then we'll read the one on the far right. So Zhang Shanlei, I think this is writing in 1931. He writes, when the warm heat theory of Ye Xiangyan, that's Ye Tianshi, so same person, that guy from the late 17th century, became popular, there was the possibility that some of the inspirations of these later scholars who followed him could slightly augment that which was missing in Zhang Zhongjing's treatise, right, the treatise of cold damage. But who could have imagined that Wu Ye was the first to propose this theory, and then Wu Zhutong, the first to write a treatise about it, would both shun Zhang Zhongjing, so this treatise of cold damage, his established principles, erroneously creating new formulas using cloying herbs that trap the pathogen, causing innumerable harms without a single benefit. Everyone has followed in this path without reflection, adopting habits that completely mislead the people, devoting one's entire life to this mistaken approach without ever awakening. So you can see it's pretty fun stuff. So that the warm illness school said that the herbs in the Shanghai loan were just too dangerous and too toxic. The cold damage people sort of say the formulas from the warm illness school they're gentle, but they trap the pathogens. They trap the cold, they trap the wind, they trap whatever. And instead of getting people better, they slowly kill them, is the argument. So they both have explanations for why the other side is so dangerous. And then if you look at the third column, all these are great, interesting scholars. These three doctors are all extremely famous. But I want us to look at Yun Tie Chao because I want to mention him again in a little bit. This is him writing in 1925. Very famous scholar, one of my favorites from this period. He writes, "My humble ambition is to help Chinese medicine flourish, and therefore I cannot avoid to correct false theories. The books of Wang Mengying, he is a famous warm illness scholar, Wu Zhutong, and Ye Tianshi, those are the three probably the most influential writers in the warm illness school, are filled with flaws and errors. If I were to correct each one, the stack of papers would be as high as me." So you can see this was fun research. You can just see they're just like going at each other. So I won't read the middle one, but you guys can hopefully had a chance to quickly look at Liu Yanlei is another famous writer from this period. So let me show you this. I think these critiques actually are important for like thinking about how we treat the common cold, including flu and COVID-19. And the question is, do we want to follow sort of this cold damage approach or this warm illness approach? When you kind of learn in your classes, I think you learn that both are okay. And I know that for me personally, I probably went back and forth, not really sure. One teacher said, well, if you got a sore throat, it's warm illness. If you don't have a sore throat, it's wind cold. So there's a lot to kind of explore here, but I would say maybe the thing to hold on to for me that I found most important, and this is from some of this research, is that wind really is the main pathogen for this cold damage approach to Gamao. And when you treat wind, you have to drive it out through sweating. And you may not have profuse sweating, but you usually will have a little bit of sweating. When we're in the warm illness approach, warmth is the main pathogen. And when you treat warmth, one of the main principles is that it can damage the fluids, and so sweating would be forbidden. You can't sweat it out. If I were to give you a little example of the difference here, you might think of something like a strep throat. Maybe falls a little bit more into that warm illness category. And a strep throat will look a lot like a cold, but you're not going to have the nasal congestion or the body aches. It's just going to be right in the throat. That, in my opinion, would call for a little bit more of like a warm illness approach. But we're talking about a cold with fever, chills, body aches, nasal congestion, headaches. That to me really goes on this cold damage approach, and wind is the key thing. So let me explain why I argue that. I really, and there's kind of a little bit of a personal history of this too, but I've really been influenced by two doctors in this. And I didn't know this at first, but I really was like particularly intrigued by a famous Shanghai doctor named Xu Xiaopu. And you can see he's an early 20th century doctor. And then another one who's who I got to meet, and I believe he must have passed away by now, but Li Bingnan is a famous doctor in Guangzhou, and I got to interview him as part of my research, and then later kind of fell in love with some of his writings. And what I later found out, to the surprise, as I was trying to think about treatments for Gamal, was that they both had kind of connections to this earlier research I was doing. The most interesting one is Xu Xiaopu. Kind of disciple is a misnomer here, but he kind of became a bit of a follower of another famous doctor named Zhu Weizhu, and I didn't give you a quote earlier, but Zhu Weizhu is most famous. He was sometimes known as Zhu Fuzi. Fuzi means aconite, so aconite Zhu. Fuzi is an extremely warming herb that you'll learn about in your courses. It's very important, in my opinion, if you're treating things like rheumatoid arthritis. He was famous for using it also as almost a cardiotonic. So he would take, one famous story that is well known kind of from this period is that he treated the son of Xu Xiaopu, who was sick with typhoid fever. Now in the early 20th century China, there was all kinds of epidemics, cholera, typhoid, smallpox. If you were a Chinese medicine doctor, you're trying to deal with these sort of epidemic diseases. Xu Xiaopu at the time was part of the warm illness camp, which is the more popular one, but he was failing to kind of cure his son, and his son was simply getting worse and worse, and dying from typhoid fever was not uncommon. Now, from the cold damage perspective, a warm illness treatment might make you worse. And finally, the family members were sort of saying to him, like, you've got to, this is all, everyone knows each other in Shanghai, call Zhu Weizhu, get him to take a look at our son. And he was terrified to do that because he knew Zhu Weizhu was famous for using aconite. Aconite is one of the most warming herbs there is. It's quite toxic. It has to be treated before you use it, and then it has to be boiled an extra amount of time before you ever put in a formula. So it is without a doubt an extremely toxic plant. And the father, Xu Xiaopu, just said, no, I can't do that because I know what he'll do. He'll write a formula with aconite in it, and that'll kill my son. So if I have him make a house call, that's the end of it. But he finally gets to the point where he's just absolutely desperate, and he's sort of given up. Zhu Weizhu comes in, of course, uses Fuzi and turns it around and cures his son. And it was such sort of a revelation, I think, to Xu Xiaopu that he kind of converts to the cold damage camp. He doesn't quite become a disciple of Zhu Weizhu because Zhu Weizhu says, no, you're a famous doctor, you can't do that, that's inappropriate. But his sons start to study with him. And I became very influenced by his writings. And if you look at his writings, extremely interesting, but he's got a very strong kind of cold damage approach, not only to Gamal, but to many conditions. And my other big influence is Li Bingnan, this more contemporary doctor who was a student of Yun Tietzhao. Yun Tietzhao was the guy who said he would have a stack of papers as tall as him if he had to correct all the errors of the warring illness school. So for various reasons, I think when we're looking at something like Gamal, we're really not looking, we're looking at something that needs to be, we need to drive out the wind, we need to use herbs that cause sweating. We really need to look at it through the cold damage perspective. Let me give you a few principles on how to treat it, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the DAO Labs approach too. So the first principle, and this really comes from Xu Xiaopu and Li Bingnan, is you need to release the exterior and drive out the wind. Now, of course, you're going to learn this in your courses. Jie Biao, release the exterior, drive out the wind. So that's not so new, but what's important here, and something you probably won't learn in your courses, is that we have both warm, acrid herbs, or pungent, depending on how you translate that term, and we also have cooling, pungent herbs. But the warm, acrid ones are the ones that are the much more powerful ones. They're the ones that have the pungency to really push the wind out and other pathogens out. So when you have this, and when you have an illness in the exterior, and this is going to present it with fever, chills, body aches, headaches, nasal congestion, maybe a scratchy throat, you need these warm, acrid herbs to push it out. They open up the pores. There might be the patient might have sort of a gentle kind of sweat. And then that's usually when the kind of the fever breaks and things turn around. The herbs in the kind of our materia medica that are cooling and acrid really don't have that same kind of pungency. They're quite mild. And so like a famous formula like Yin Chao San, which you all know about, if you really break it down and look at it, it's mostly cooling herbs. It has very little pungent herbs. And it works in some cases, but it's really quite mild and not enough. The argument from the cold damage school is that something like Yin Chao San, because it's cooling, that the heaviness of the cooling herbs can actually take things deeper. And that's the argument from the cold damage perspective. Warm illness treatments can make things worse, actually. I personally have had that experience with that formula, Yin Chao San. I think it's a great formula, but it needs to be used correctly, and probably not for Ganmao, probably not for the common cold. And so, but we often those distinctions aren't often clear in our courses. So another couple of principles that are important too is that we're trying with treatments that are trying to drive things out. You need to also, when you want to use herbs that are a little bit uplifting, but sometimes you need to counter that with things that are sort of down bearing. So for example, I might often use an herb, something like Shengma, Chaihu, Gugen, and I apologize, I don't have good gu is Kazuru, Chaihu, you may all know. Sorry, I forget the English. These are herbs with some lifting properties, and they can help further open up the exterior. Sometimes what you want to do, and this is interesting because we saw this a lot in China with COVID-19 treatments, is you also want to open the bowels. So if things kind of get trapped in the bowels, the large intestines pair with the lungs. So sometimes if things are stuck in the bowel, you might open up the bowels. And so I've interviewed some doctors in China who are treating COVID-19 there. And for very sick patients, they would sometimes do things like they would use ginseng, which is a qi tonifying herb, but also da huang, which is another classic herb from the Treatise of Cold Damage Disorder, which is a strong purgative. And so you would think somebody who's already deficient, you wouldn't want to use this purgative, but one of the doctors I got a chance to speak with really claimed that was a great approach. So both supplementing and then purging. So you need that up and down motion. And then if there's additional things, and the additional things could include heat. You could have wind and heat, not just wind cold or cold be converting the heat. Dampness, phlegm, food stagnation, fright. Little children can sometimes have fright, which leads to seizures. For those things, you can all kind of, if you're constructing your own formula, you all want to kind of accommodate and add in some things for that too. To supplement again built on that sort of basic formula of like a warm acrid herbs. So those are some of the key principles that have really guided me, and I found it extremely helpful. And so whenever I've had the chance to treat a few COVID-19 patients in this past year, but whether it's flu or the common cold, whatever various things we can kind of put in that category of Ganmao, these are the principles that I've really found extremely useful for me. And it's just been interesting that I realized they sort of tied into my earlier research on this huge debate between the cold damage and the warm illness camps of the early 20th century. I'll give you a few more quick slides and we can spend and then we can turn to some questions. I think one thing we want to be aware of, this is very true with with the flu or with something like COVID-19, things can kind of move deeper into the body. If they do with a Ganmao, it's going to typically be to the lungs. You're going to start to see cough, phlegm, irritated throat. And then at that point, you're going to have some additional principles. It's no longer just an exterior pattern. You're going to need to maybe still drive out the wind, but you're going to have to facilitate, is sort of my translation here, move lung qi both out and down, as well as stop coughing. So that requires some additional things if you have this development and you see the pathogens moving deeper. I'll quickly tell you sort of a little bit about DAO Labs. This is sort of our new products, you'll be familiar with them, and you'll understand the rationale behind them. So these are two new things. I think they're, I'm very invested in them since I have to develop them, but they're two new formulas that I think are really great for kind of dealing with both the exterior and the interior patterns that we see most commonly. The first one is this bounce back. We're calling it bounce back, and I've given it a Chinese name, which is sort of a general Gamma Tong Yong Fang, which just means general formula for cold. But I've really pulled together some of those from those two the principles from those two doctors I mentioned, Xu Xiaopu and Li Bingnan, the ones that I found, the two pediatricians I found so important for my work. And so this is the general formula. It's the foundation of some warm, accurate herbs, some interesting combinations. For example, Xu Xiaopu, and I didn't talk about it too much here, and it may be too premature for you guys to talk about it, but things like cinnamon twig and changhua, which I forget how to say that in English, are a very interesting combination. He like two warming, dispersing herbs. It has some uplifting and downbearing herbs, and some things that really go to the head and nasal passages. In my opinion, if you don't really have like a burning sore throat, you still don't want to use things that are too cooling. This has a little bit of herbs that are cooling and will help soothe the throat, but it's more warming than cooling for sure. If things move more together, then I would recommend, and I sort of designed it this way, that you would add in a second formula. You'll learn about this one. This is a classic called Jiso San, or stop cough formula. This is a formula that would be a little bit more, it could be used for acute coughs or more chronic ones if you have some phlegm or throat irritations. And we can talk about how to take, these are all come in tablets and some kind of easy to use pouches. And then if you find out, and sometimes this happens, the exterior is kind of resolved, you no longer have fever and chills, you've just kind of got the cough that's lingering, then you would kind of just finish up with just Sozan, or what we call Breathe Clear. So anyways, that's a little bit about the DAO Labs solution there. But now you kind of know the history behind these formulas. And I can, and maybe another time, or if you want now, I can kind of go a little more deeply into some of the combinations that are in there. Thanks for your interest. Here's some emails for you all. If you want to write this to my personal email, that's eikarchmer@gmail.com. My email with DAO Labs is drkarchmer@mydaolabs.com. Check out the websites. I do try to do a fair amount of practitioner-oriented stuff at the My DAO Labs website. So if this feels informative to you, this is probably even a little bit more in depth than what I typically do. But if this feels interesting to you, you can kind of get some of my other webinars or writings there that are a little bit more practitioner-oriented. If you sign up, I think it's all for free. Eventually, I think we'll probably have some CEU offerings. But most of it's just all available kind of in the resource room. Those are that's sort of my presentation for today. Do you all have any questions? Do you feel like this was going too deep and too fast, or kind of just right? Did it feel informative to you?
Yeah, I have a question actually. So you've and the folks that you've talked to over in China, as well as the folks with COVID that you've treated, what, because COVID moves pretty quickly. It's like a 1 to 2 day kind of thing. And then all of a sudden it shoots down into the far interior. What kind of section of the Shanghan or the Wenbing, or what kind of things do you do in that case?
And I haven't treated too many folks with COVID, but I would say, my sense of it is most folks aren't getting into really serious trouble. Well, it really depends. Some folks, I take that back. It's so variable. So some folks kind of get into trouble very quickly. Other folks, one thing that's very unique about it may just be a little bit more like a flu presentation, fever, chills, body aches, and that can go on for a week. And then they kind of get the cytokine storm and they get this sort of immune system reaction. And then they kind of get into very, very deep trouble. And then at that point, then at that point, you're looking at some very different treatments. You wouldn't really be in the realm of sort of like these particular DAO Lab formulas. Different people I've talked, some folks I've talked to have really said, yeah, first 4 or 5 days is Shanghan. After that, it's Wenbing. But I'm not sure I'm not sure there's a universal thing there. And like I said, I haven't personally seen enough patients, but some of the other folks I spoke with and have read about maybe did like Shanghan formulas no matter what. So for example, if you mentioned ephedra decoction earlier on. I mean, that's a formula that's really could be a foundation for like treating a basic pneumonia. And many, some of my teachers in China, this is before kind of COVID, but these are particularly pediatricians. If they were treating young kids with a pneumonia, they would really work with ephedra decoction would be their foundation for treating it, and they really wouldn't go. Some of the teachers I had, I didn't see them using the warm illness formulas that much in those situations. So I think some of the answers is going to depend a little bit on presentation and just what else is going on with the particular patient, and then kind of really having to adapt in that particular situation.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, I hope that helps. I guess as you can see, I'm a little bit lean a little bit more to cold damage stuff, and I think in particular with this situation, I would say with SARS. So SARS was also a big deal back in 2003 in China, and a lot of the formulas that were being really promoted, and there weren't nearly as many cases, but a lot of the formulas that were being promoted by Chinese medicine doctors at the time were more based on Wenbing formulas. That tended to be more of a consensus. Now, one reason, however, may be that the epicenter of SARS was in Guangzhou. That's in the south. There tends to be much more kind of affinity for warm illness approaches there. But sometimes it's hard to know exactly what people are doing. They say one thing and sometimes do another.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One more, if I can ask one more question. So the coagulopathy of COVID-19, they talk about that a lot, and like right ventricle blowouts and stuff like that. So in that case, would that be like a Shanghan application? Because they have a lot of blood moving due to cold pathogen.
Yeah, I think, I guess my inclination might be to start more with Shanghan and then maybe add in some blood activating herbs, and that's some of the things I've seen that's been pretty consistent with what I've seen with more that I guess more, again, there's a real range here, and I don't know if there's any one consensus, but I might start. I mean, you might want to see what are again, it'd still be really based on your presentation. You still have to do your Bianzheng Linzhi, but I might lean more towards those Shanghan forms, just because I think if you're still trying to drive out the wind and cold and the dampness have often been what people have really focused on here and with COVID-19, and then on top of that, you want to get at the coagulation issues, and that might be secondary to like those other two key pathogens like cold and dampness. So there's been a lot of focus on digestion too with COVID-19. So if you encounter patients with that, then I think that's also very important to, and that's less included in these like particular DAO Labs formulas, but digestion could be a big key here, especially with the dampness.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I didn't get a chance to introduce myself. I'm actually a fourth year student at OCOM.
Great.
I'm curious, when you're formulating your products, well, I guess just to start with, we learn, or my perception of what we learned at OCOM is that, maybe one explanation for the success of Wenbing theory is that it's from the south, it's a hotter climate, affects people's constitutions, and warm pathogen is more of an issue there, and therefore the herbs might be more effective treating people in that climate. So when you're making your formulations, are you accommodating for people possibly taking them in different parts of the world or different seasons, or is it kind of a mixture of both theories, or is it more leaning on Shanghan Lun principles and herbs?
Yeah, a great question. You're totally right. People in the South will definitely argue it's, with this climate, feel like if you walk around Guangzhou, people are like, feel this heat, feel this humidity, like, we need something for, we need something for this heat and humidity. So they definitely will feel that the climatic issues are a big factor. Again, there's a lot of debate. When I'm thinking about formulating something here, I'm thinking a little bit more about the U.S., which is where we're probably going to sell these products. Trying to think of something general, but you can't. If you really want to be specific, you need to be using sort of the bulk herbs here, and then you really need to. So if you're really dealing with somebody who's quite sick, then at that point you want to move beyond sort of standardized formulas. But so trying to, for me, like with these particular formulas, I'm just trying to think of like in general principles. And so here I'm leaning more on Shanghai principles of driving out wind and cold. But again, you need to, climatic issues, underlying conditions, all those things kind of need to be taken into consideration. And so I wouldn't, the things that might be appropriate for many people are certainly not necessarily appropriate for any one individual. So anytime you're developing sort of a general formula, you're thinking about sort of what's going to work in principle, and recognizing that there'll be cases where it's not going to be the best choice. So I would, say that to all of you too, like, understand, when to kind of stick with some of your general formulas, and then be aware of when you need to like really specialize and do something very individualized.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah. And I would say too, there's, and I've had plenty, I've had this experience so many times in my clinic. There's sort of the easy cases and there's the hard cases. And in the easy cases, if you're kind of just in the ballpark, if you've got like the right patent medicine, that's all it takes. It's this kind of like the patient just needs a push. And then you're going to have your difficult cases where somebody's quite sick, and I mean, maybe it's COVID-19, but it may be anything. I mean, I can think of a recent epilepsy. It's not epilepsy, excuse me. Epilepsy is one case, but also a recent eczema case that's been very tricky. Like, and I've had to have it has to be like just right. And in fact, just this morning, my patient was complaining like, "Oh, it was so great last week, but it's flaring up again." I was like, "Oh, I took, sorry, I took 2 things out, and I probably shouldn't have. It was premature. Let me drop off some extra, a little add into your formula. This is cooking with some with the bulk herbs here." That little add in is, I suspect, is going to make the difference and get it back on track. So there's times where just adding in 1 or 2 things makes all the difference in the world. And if you miss it and you don't have those things, you may never get it. And that's where you really want to be dealing with the bulk herbs. And those are kind of like thrilling moments when you kind of finally unlock, this complicated puzzle. And then there's a lot of other moments where it's just, it's not that complicated. Just something kind of in the general part is all you need, and that ends up being just like a slam dunk. So I think there's a real range here, and that's part of what I think you learn to judge as you get into your practice. Some more questions?
I was just wondering, I'm newer to the Chinese medicine being a first year, but for most practitioners, do they have one school that they more subscribe to, or do you learn both of them more thoroughly and just try and interpret which one would be correct in the given situation? Um, I don't know. Any information on that would be interesting.
So I can just speak to kind of my experience in China with my teachers. I would say most of them, and particularly folks who are a little bit younger, didn't really subscribe to what they were much more eclectic, and that's kind of how it's taught. Um, it is sort of taught like this debate from the early 20th century that I've been describing. Like none of us had any inkling that there was ever that kind of like tension between these different approaches. So I think most people tend to be a bit eclectic. At a school in China, and maybe this wouldn't be quite true for OCOM, but you would actually have departments. So you'd have a department of the Shanghan Lun, of the Treatise of Cold Damage Disorder. You have a department of warm illnesses. So you'd expect within those departments that those people tend to specialize maybe in those things and have more affinity to that. And certainly there was older doctors who would have reputations, and they might, and as part of that reputation, you might understand them to be a more of a warm illness specialist, or more of a cold damage specialist. But that didn't, but a lot of people didn't identify that way either. And I'm not, I would say, and I think there's a little bit of different historical moments too. So I was there in the late 90s, and less so the last 10 years, but in the early 2000s as well. There was less of that association, but since the early 2000s, there's been like a big reflourishing of like Shanghan. Like anytime you walk into a bookstore, like all the new Chinese medicine books, anyway, a Chinese medicine bookstore, most of the new books are a huge number of new books have been really more in the cold damage kind of camp. There's been a real resurgence of interest in that. I definitely did not feel like did not feel that that was not existing in the 1990s or in the 2000s. That's been a real, I'd say, in the last 10 years. Maybe that's going to fade out too. For a while, there was a big interest in sort of like Japanese Campo medicine writings. Kind of in the early 2000s, that was a big. Now, Japanese Campo medicine has a much stronger cold damage kind of history to it, and almost very little writing on warm illnesses. It really didn't kind of make it to Japan. So there's different trends and things change. But I would say overall, most people don't have a strong association. Not like what we just talked about in the some of those examples I gave you. Perhaps leaning one way or the other, but so you hear about some things, but it's not. I don't think people think of it people don't think of it as like a war between these two approaches there today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Some other questions?
Is there any conflict like this with acupuncture, or is it only with herbals for the heat and cold?
Just sort of big debates like this within acupuncture. My sense is no, although there's acupuncture has a little bit of kind of a separate history. I think for a long time, herbal medicine really, because of some historical reasons, acupuncture was really repressed in the Qing dynasty, the last major imperial dynasty, as just being like un-Confucian, because it's a little bit too barbershoppy, touching people and putting needles on them, things like that. So it was not. So herbal medicine clearly becomes like a much more elite version of elite practice within Chinese medicine. Acupuncture much less so. And we should also remember that acupuncture what we think of today as sort of like these, our thin filament needles, Haojin in Chinese. There's nothing like that in the early 20th century. The needles were all, probably it's an exaggeration, but people will say they're like small nails or something like that. So it was a much more kind of aggressive practice. So I think acupuncture is having its own kind of reflourishing, but it wasn't. It was a little bit outside some of these debates, is my sort of understanding of it, because these debates were more kind of in the realm of elite medicine, and elite medicine was for scholars and literati and people who are like steeped in like Confucianism and things like that. And so that was all much more herbal medicine, and acupuncture was a secondary thing. And there's a huge amount of innovation within acupuncture in the 20th century, but it's not quite caught up in these debates.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And then as far as wind, because you said that was kind of the main pathogen that kind of gets in, aside from, in the cold weather, aside from covering up, what other preventative measures like would be done to kind of, right, prevention's the best way to treat, right?
Covering up is a big one, and I've got like short sleeves on. I'm not good at it myself, though North Carolina's not so cold. But people are very conscientious about covering up. They'd be very conscientious about just exposing themselves to the elements. Eating cold foods could be a big concern. And it varies from person to person. I would say being also just aware too of vulnerability. So and the more you practice, the more you'll see this. There are just folks who are like so susceptible to getting sick, and this is where a formula like Yuping Fengsan, jade windscreen is really great. Like when you've got like qi deficiencies or other kinds of deficiencies, you're going to have a tendency to get sick more often and get sicker when you do. You're going to be the sort of person who's, like with COVID-19, more likely to end up with some bad outcomes. So in addition to sort of protecting yourself and being more aware of exposing yourself to the elements, and there's limits to what you can do there sometimes, but also being more attuned, helping your patients be more attuned to whether they're more vulnerable. And this could be folks with perhaps history of like complicated digestive issues or things like that. They'll in a broad sense they'll be more vulnerable, and so they want to take additional precautions.
So like you were saying, we can only do so much to protect ourselves. If you were someone that was like had a patient that maybe worked outside a lot, or lots of us or most of us that go to school at OCOM are in Portland and it's very rainy here. Mm-hmm. So what are some maybe common things that we have access to that you might recommend, like if we come in from the rain or in from the cold, that we could do to heat our bodies up, or that could counteract some of those things the wind and the cold are doing to us?
Well, it sounds like I think the first step is just being aware. And a lot of starting there is already a huge step in the right direction. And a lot of folks aren't. I have to admit, when I was a student, like I didn't really get it. I was like, wind, it was just a very abstract concept to me. And I was like, I'll memorize it, or I'll give the right answer on the test. And it wasn't until sort of you kind of are thinking about it, and then you sort of I remember very clearly once I was living in the dorms, and now, so you might think that like at a Chinese medicine, every university, everyone's like super conscious about the stuff, but they weren't. And one of the things, like in a place like Beijing, there's a lot of central heating, but there was always like broken windows and like doors flapping open, and the winters are extremely cold there. And I remember like taking a shower in the dorm bathroom, And there's just sort of, you know, a broken window and a cold breeze kind of blowing through. And I just like was in the middle of a shower. I think I was probably also like just like really run down from like staying up too late, studying too hard, pulling all-nighters for exams and things like that. And I just felt like a shiver go through me, and I was like, boom, like that. I was just sick. And so, you know, starting with that awareness, like, oh, that's not a good situation for me to be, you know, in a shower, damp environment with like, you know, winter breezes kind of gusting through the bathroom. So I think starting with that, taking precautions, maybe and then it can be a little bit more individual. It can be if you've really got some, you know, think about what are your own issues. If you really got some dietary issues, thinking about ways to address those, being just more conscious there, you know, doing, you know, any number of things. I think kind of just build yourself up. I think eating right, exercise. I think those are all like super important. So there isn't maybe any one magical thing, but but I think starting with, you know, recognizing that the Chinese medicine concepts are really trying to describe like phenomena that are like all around us, and then you see it. And so I don't know, living like I remember always learning about like, you know, don't live in a damp basement. That was like something we always learned about in our textbooks. So that just didn't like, would that really make you sick? Is the dampness that bad? And well, when you start looking at it, you go, yes, actually, I have plenty of patients who like have basement, like a place here, like I live in the hills of the mountains of North Carolina, where there's a lot of basement apartments and things like that, and you get plenty of patients who are like come in with various kinds of like joint pain. You're like, yeah, that's the dampness, you know, it's your living condition. So now sometimes you can't do something about it. Sometimes you can't, people can't move, they can't. But then you try to adapt, or you try to think of some sort of herbal solution, or you try to like, again, kind of once you kind of identify the problem, then there's maybe, you know, all kinds of ways to address it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Here we can shut the. So I'm going to try and stop the share here. Did I do this?
You had mentioned that you wrote a few books. Would you mind just saying what the title is and maybe a brief?
Yeah, be happy to. Sorry, I'm trying to stop the screen share, but now I can't find my buttons aren't coming up. So hold on one second. Well, okay. Well, maybe we won't stop it. We won't worry about the screen share. In terms of I've got a book that'll be coming out probably, I think, by the end of 2021. That's going to be called Prescriptions for Virtuosity. And it's called Innovation and the Post-Colonial Struggle of Chinese Medicine. So that book is very much a book about the relationship of Chinese medicine to Western medicine in China, and how doctors think about how doctors work through and think about how to use the two practices together. And that's like one of the, and it was quite shocking to me, but one of the things that's so fundamental to like clinical and hospital practice in China is that any doctor of Chinese medicine really has to do both, and has to do both quite well. And so that kind of puts a certain demand on you, and it forces you to kind of be nimble about moving back and forth between the two medical systems. But there isn't any one way to do it. There isn't any there's sort of some basic principles that are sort of around, but so that book really kind of looks at that process. You might, to kind of tie it into like the Ancient Formulas article, which is more historical, you might say that the confrontation with Western medicine in the late 20th century in China displaces all the debates between like Shanghan and Wenbing. So in the early 20th century, and this isn't, I think, appreciated enough, Western medicine just, one, it wasn't very present in China. It was there was a very small number of biomedical practitioners. Into Western medicine in the early 20th century was just a very different medical practice than it is today. So many of the things like ventilators, CTs, all kinds of emergency medicine, all kinds of drugs and treatments weren't really around then. So Chinese medicine was really the main form of medicine in the early 20th century. So I've got another article. A lot of this will come up in the book, but another article you might really be interested in. What do I call it? I call it slow medicine. How Chinese medicine became effective for only treating chronic illnesses. That's hopefully, I think, with something like COVID-19 that's starting to shift ideas. It's certainly a little bit of a shift after SARS. But when I was a student in the 1990s, nobody thought Chinese medicine was good for any kind of emergency medicine. So that's another article, ancient form of this. I've got there's a history of Chinese medicine article if you're interested in kind of a short history that I wrote together with Volker Scheid, who you may be familiar with his scholarship. I believe that's also available online. You'd have to just search for that. And I've got another article that looks a little bit at a lot of these things will reappear in the book in various ways. That looks at there's a big debate in China about whether structure and function, and one of the claims is that Western medicine is good for treating structural problems, kind of like surgery, through surgery, and Chinese medicine is better at functional problems. And so that's another kind of a tension that I look at in the book. And there's also an article on that one I think I call it, that one has a complicated name. I call that like the expectations and suppressions of the times or something. It's a quote from actually one of the doctors that I mentioned in this talk, Liu Yanlei. So there's a few things out there. Some of them I know are open source. So if you just search my name, you might be able to get to 3 or 4 of them. And then hopefully the book will be out by the end of the year.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? Well, maybe we'll end here. You guys have been amazing, and these are great questions, and love to talk about it all with you some more. Anyways, feel free to reach out through either of these emails. Certainly check out the DAO Labs website. That's a hopefully can be a nice resource for you all down the line. And enjoy your studies at OCOM. I'm thrilled you guys are at a great school, and I know you're learning and destined to do awesome stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I'll figure out how to end this at some point, but feel free to sign off. And I don't see any of my usual buttons here, but I'll find them in a second. And good luck with your studies.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, this was fun.